heard about the movie Poltergeist, but I didn't expect to spend an evening with such a rambunctious entity. The event in question took place at a friend's family home in Vista, New York. There were 6 young professional adults present for a weekend gathering, and all of us had driven up from New York City earlier that morning. It was a typical blustery fall day in the year. Iridescent leaves that were falling with the wind tore them from their summer home, showered the ground with flashes of yellows, reds, and oranges, making perfect highlights to the all-gray backdrop. The converted barn that we were making home for the weekend was situated on a lake and was completely surrounded by forest. There were plenty of activities to keep us all busy, firewood to be collected, beds to be made, food shopping, and other errands to run. After all the details had been attended to, we split up. Some of us went hiking in the woods, one read a book, and others went for a joyride in the convertible that was at our disposal. I'd adopted for the hike in the woods with Mora, our hostess, the only other female present that weekend. By the end of the day, the weather had grown threatening and the wind became aggressive and unpredictable. It was clear to all that it was time to go inside. We had left the windows and doors open to the fresh air all afternoon, and after closing the building up tight, we built a fire and removed the first course of the evening meal from the fridge to be heated on the stovetop. We were having homemade summer squash and red bell pepper soup. I'd been given the responsibility of choosing the music, and when Maura walked by me and asked that I keep an eye on the soup for a minute, I responded with a sure. Maura had just shut the bathroom door when I heard a very strange sound coming from the kitchen. Before I could pick myself up and out of the cross-legged position into which I had folded myself, Maura, who had also heard the noise, came rushing out of the bathroom. Basically, we arrived on the scene together. Somehow the soup had violently exploded, spewing a third of its contents into an area 3 feet in diameter in every direction. Feeling somewhat responsible as I had remained in the living room rather than stationing myself in the kitchen as Maura had been, I picked up the pan, thinking that a swift temperature change must have caused rapid-fire air bubbles to erupt. But when I felt the bottom of the saucepan, it wasn't even warm. "That's really odd," I said to Maura. We called the rest of the crew into the kitchen and then inquired if anyone had tampered with the soup. Everyone claimed to be as confused as we were. We began the task of cleaning up the mess, and Maura became concerned that there might not be enough soup to go around. The cleanup efforts took 20 minutes because we kept finding other places where the soup had splashed. The fan grate and light just above the stove was the hardest hit, and we used a lot of paper towels trying to wipe the infiltrated areas clean. I forgot to make that sound. Maura and I were still in the kitchen when Gordon, one of the house guests, decided that he wanted a glass of wine. He had just opened the chosen bottle and was in the process of pouring from it when the wine glass he held in his hand flew in a perfect upward arch and then came straight down to the floor. I saw that the glass was taking very deliberate movements, and Gordon seemed to lack any control over the glass. It was as if an invisible hand had knocked it out of his grasp on purpose. We stood there, mouths slightly open, until Gordon asked more as a joke than a serious question, "Is there a ghost in the house?" "No, there are no ghosts," Morris said emphatically. We all marveled at the fact that the wine glass had broken up the stem and not the delicate rim, as would have been expected. "Strange," came Gordon's response. Maura was in the middle of handing out what's left of the homemade soup when, without warning, all the lights in the house went out. We all became motionless as if our bodies had become pillars of salt. After a moment of silence, everyone started speaking at once. I heard someone blame Maura's husband, Ed, for this most recent situation. I quietly called out for Mama, and when she answered, I took a step closer to the sound of her voice. Then suddenly the lights came back on. Ed was visibly agitated, and he picked up the phone in order to call the electric company to inquire whether or not the pending storm was causing power outages. His face went ashen. "What's wrong?" Maura demanded. "Well, the phone is dead," was his reply. All at once, everyone began to offer possible causes. A few well-chosen swear words were spoken, and again the entire house lost all power. Ed went to the window to see if the street lights were off as well, because the power to the house was connected to the lines that fed the lights that lined the old country road. Those lights were on, which suggested a blown fuse in the house. The fuse box was in the basement, and no one offered to go down and check it out. It's funny how logic and rational thought disappear when there's an overload in the imagination. "It's the storm," someone said. By now, Maura had lit some candles, and we at least had the glow of the tiny flames to guide our steps. We made our way to the dinner table in almost complete darkness and sat down just in time for the lights to return all foreign shadows to their proper places. "That's no blown fuse," Ed declared. "This is going to be an interesting dinner," I thought to myself. A warm fire was behind us, and the conversation around the table soon became centered on the odd occurrences that had taken place in the house. Suddenly, Gordon, who was seated opposite me, stopped with his spoon midway to his mouth. The manner in which his shoulders climbed up to his ears and his head jerked ever so slightly to the right made me stop what I was doing and shift my full attention toward the direction from which his reaction had stemmed. I heard myself gasp. Within the indoor atrium, which had become sanctuary to a collection of antique weather vanes, a single weather vane, which hung from the ceiling by a chain, was swinging violently in a 180-degree angle. No other object was moving, not even a single fern frond swayed, nothing. The pace with which the lone weather vane was swinging was even-tempered and exact. The violence with which it swung was very disturbing. Everyone was watching, unable to fully comprehend the event we were all witnessing. My husband Eric stood up from his chair and took a candle from the center of the table over to the atrium to search for a possible draft of some kind. None was found. All the while, the weather vane, continued its mad antics, swinging closer and closer to the wall. There was an orb in the center of the weather vane made of some type of non-opaque glass, and if it were to hit the wall, it would shatter, which would leave us with a lot of explaining to do. Tomorrow's father, who owned the place. I asked Eric, who was still standing, if he could stop the antique vane from swinging. Ed dramatically bellowed out, "Don't touch it!" But Eric reached out and manually stopped the object from swinging. However, just as he did so, our friend Ed immediately started to have trouble breathing. Ed was hyperventilating and had to go outside in the cold night air to catch his breath. The wine was flowing in our bloodstreams now, and that seemed to help our ability to deal with the events of the evening. The dishwasher had been loaded and the table cleared. Nobody really seemed to want to talk about the incidents, perhaps because there was no way to agree upon an explanation. Soon, however, we couldn't help ourselves, and the discussion turned to what might be going on in the house. Ed was accused by one of the guests of having rigged the whole affair, but I more than doubted that was the case. The host decided that if only to quiet the unrest we were all feeling, he wanted to play a game on the antique roulette wheel that stood in the hallway. En route to the hallway that housed the weathered roulette wheel, Ed stopped dead in his tracks. In the corner of the room that Ed was facing, there was a fine cloud of cold air visible to the naked eye. It was so cold we could see Ed's breath as he exhaled. Nowhere else in the house was this cold. Everyone placed a body part in the cold spot to feel for themselves, and sure enough, the area was much colder than the thermometer outside, which read in even 40 degrees. "This is really weird," Ed said in a disbelieving tone. Ed then led everyone over to the roulette wheel. Everyone but me joined in the game of calling out a number to see if the wheel would stop on it. There were some failed attempts at matching the called number to that of the wheel, but when it was Ed's turn, he said something like, "Let's see if that old ghost wants to play with me." He called out a number while challenging the specter to play, and I kid you not, during the next 3 turns, Ed called out the number, and even before the wheel could come to a stop naturally, the wheel stopped abruptly on the exact number he'd called. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. I wasn't amused and directed my displeasure to the unseen player of the wheel. "Get out of here," I said to the invisible guest. "We're bored with your silly antics. Go find someplace else to camp out." By now it was really late. Laura was the first to announce that she was off to bed and asked Ed to lock up the house. Ed chose me to go around the house and help him secure the locks on all the windows and doors. Together, we systematically locked up the entire house. The front door was the last on our minds. This was an original door belonging to the barn from which the house had been converted. It was oversized, old, and very heavy. The door had a large black rusty bolt on it that acted as the knob, and it made a lot of noise when it was slid aside. I watched Ed as he used the weight of his body to aid him in shutting tight the wooden door. Once finished, he gave me a peck on the cheek and took himself up to bed. And we 4 guests moved into the den area and sat about discussing the fashions and music of the jazz age of the 1920s and 30s. We had chosen to ignore the night's events, and we spent a pleasant half an hour talking about purely material things. Then I suddenly felt a cold blast of air. The chill was directly followed by a noise that amounted to an almost inaudible creaking sound. I looked at the 3 men who sat opposite me and shook my head. No way," I said adamantly. I got up from the chair and in one step climbed up the 3 short stairs to peek around the corner to see what I expected was true. The front door stood wide open, just hanging on its hinges, laying flat up against the wall. I couldn't believe it. The door had made the hideously loud noise it generally made as the door scraped the threshold, and that was what gave me the creeps. I asked Eric to please close and secure the door once again, and this prompted everyone to call it a night. The other guests disappeared into their allotted bedrooms. Eric and I were to sleep in the den. For the first time that evening, I wondered if I could muster up enough energy to drive back to the city. Then I took stock of the hour and the amount that I had to drink. All right, I said to the uninvited guest, if you are spending the night, then please go to bed now. The lights in the den were on a rheostat, directly following my tired yet motherly command to go to bed. The lights turned themselves up to full brightness. Eric and I were standing in the middle of the room staring at each other when the light slowly came down to an almost off position, then immediately climbed up again to the highest level of brightness. Finally, they turned and stayed off. That capped off the spooky events for that weekend, but the following weekend, just after midnight, I picked up the telephone receiver to be greeted by a very excited voice repeating, "It's happening again!" I thought it was a prank caller and almost hung up. When I realized it was Ed, I sat upright in bed and became alert. "What's happening again?" I asked him to clarify. Ed then proceeded to tell me that he and Maura had driven up to the house in Vista from Kennedy Airport for picking up some friends of theirs who had just arrived from Europe. They had told their friends the story from the weekend before and were met with disbelief and no small amount of chiding. Upon entering the country house, the two couples made their way to the atrium so that Ed could show the faithless just what he had been talking about. Ed turned on the light so that all could see, and much to the surprise of everyone, the weather vane was again swinging violently. Without interfering with the lightning rod gone mad, Ed immediately phoned me. Why? Good question. I was 5 hours away in Pennsylvania. It was past midnight, and there was really nothing I could do over the phone anyway. I told him to calm down and to tell the poltergeist to get the hell out of the house now. There were no more phone calls and no further incidents, as friends did walk away from the weekend with a bit more of an open mind, but Maura's father still doesn't believe our story.